We'll be learning together a talk from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which was given on Shabbos Parshas Bo and Shabbos Parshas Beshalach in the year Tafshin Nun Beis, 1992. The Rebbe spoke there about the importance and power of the Jewish women, specifically in connection with the time of the year, the Parsha, the Haftorah, and specifically in connection to bringing the Geulah. All of these aspects of the Parsha and the Haftorah and the time all express the idea that the Jewish women are the ones who will bring the Geulah and in whose merit Mashiach will come. And so I'd like to learn this talk with you in depth with all the sources and footnotes that the Rebbe brings in the edited Sicha. And I'm going to take it part by part so that we can really appreciate each idea on its own. So the Rebbe starts out talking about the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rebbe Rayatz, whose yahrzeit is Yud Shvat. And this talk was given on the Shabbos before and after Yud Shvat, Vav Shvat and Yud Gimel Shvat. So the Rebbe says the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe Rayatz, was one of the unique things about him was that he spoke to Jewish women in learning, encouraging them in Torah and mitzvahs, and specifically to learn Chassidus. The previous Rebbe really recognized the importance of the Jewish women in their influence in their home and in their household, the way that they have the responsibility to nurture the Yiras Shamayim of their children and of their spouse as well. So even though in previous generations the main involvement of Torah learning was with the men, and through them the women learned and gained their Yiras Shamayim and influence. But nowadays in this generation, we need to give that directly to the women, and the women themselves have to learn and to be inspired in Torah mitzvahs and specifically in Chassidus, because Chassidus Chabad is a foundation for Yiras Shamayim and Avos Hashem, and these are mitzvahs tamidiyos that are incumbent upon the Jewish women equally as the men. And in order to have a very strong Avos Hashem and Yiras Hashem, the teachings of Chassidus strengthen that, and therefore it's important that the woman should learn Chassidus as well. And this then has an influence on their home and the people in their home, because she is the Akeres Habayis, the one who really has the main influence and impact on her home. Like we said, and she has the ability to influence her children and husband as well. As we know from the Gemara, that the women get a merit in the Torah learning of their husbands and of their children, because they're the ones who bring the children to learn. They're the ones who kind of allow their husbands to study and wait for them to come home, and even if necessary give permission for them to go study. Now that's as it's quoted in the Gemara. However, nowadays already it's not just the women gaining merit for what their husbands and children do, but they themselves have the merit of learning Torah, which they do themselves, and which, like the previous Rebbe was emphasizing, that the women nowadays do need to learn. And the source for this idea is really in Torah. By we see two places where the women were first and, in a sense, better in connection to Matan Torah and in connection to the building of the Mishkan, which are both very fundamental aspects of Judaism and, at that time, the start of the Jewish people. Now, the Rebbe here references a known Sicha, a known talk of the previous Rebbe, which unfortunately is not so known, and I would like to reference that at the end of this class. But there, the Rebbe was speaking to a group of Jewish women in Riga in the year 1934. So this was many, many years ago already. The previous Rebbe was advocating for Jewish women to be involved in their own learning, to take responsibility for their own learning, and their involvement in Yiras Shamayim and the chinuch of the home. And there the Rebbe points out these two ideas, which we're going to explain here in short, and also elaborates even further a lesson that we can learn from it in our way of life at home. I just want to add on a parenthetical note that the reason why I'm doing this is because of the importance of Jewish women to learn Torah and to take ownership of their own Judaism, which is something that the previous Lubavitch Rebbe really advocated for, which is why he would speak to groups of women and encourage them to take ownership of their own Judaism, to take the time to learn and to nurture themselves with Yiras Shamayim, because that's, as we're going to learn in this talk, is something very significant and relevant now in this time as we're getting closer to the Geulah and to the time of Mashiach. So the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe here mentions that the source for this idea of the woman taking precedence is by Matan Torah, where it says in Parshas Yisro, and Rashi comments, the pasuk says Ko Samar Leves Yaakov V'Sagid Livnei Yisrael, and Rashi comments that Ko Samar Leves Yaakov we know these are the women, and V'Sagid Livnei Yisrael, these are the men. And there we see that the women were spoken to first. And at the time of the giving donations for the Mishkan in Parshas Teruma, Hashem says, "Va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti v'socham." You should make a mikdash, and I shall dwell in them. And there, so we have the command to build a Mishkan, and there that command, as Rashi says, "B'socham lo nemar ela b'soch kol echad ve'echad," that it not just the Mishkan in the desert, but within every single person, we have to make a home for Hashem. And in Chassidus, the Rebbe in a previous Maimer explains at length that when it says kol echad ve'echad, it's not limited to the masculine, but it includes also the females, the feminine, kol achas ve'achas as well, because the mitzvah to build a Beis HaMikdash, to build a Mishkan, a home for Hashem, is one of the mitzvah, is a mitzvah that is incumbent on every Jew, the man and the woman equally. And it's also the idea of making a home for Hashem in yourself is like one of the mitzvahs tmidius. It's not time bound, and it is a mitzvah for the Jewish woman as well. And we see that by this time, the women also came first, as it says when it describes the giving of the donations in Parshas Vayakel, Vayavo Hanashim al Hanashim, that the men came al Hanashim, which means that the women were already there and the men came afterwards after them. And the reason why the women were there first was because they were wearing their jewelry and they had it ready at hand, and they just took it off themselves and were happily giving it to the donations of the Mishkan, whereas the men, those who had gold and silver or gold ornaments and things, had to go home and get them to bring them. But it's not just a practical idea that they were there first and therefore they were giving what they had at hand, but it's more than that. In addition to the fact that they were there first, and that they were spoken to first by Matan Torah, also in the quality of these events, the women had priority. By Matan Torah, right after Matan Torah, the men, there was the sin of the Chet HaEgel, the golden calf, when the men gave their gold and silver to make this idol, which was exactly the opposite of the whole idea of Matan Torah and serving Hashem. Whereas the women refused to participate. And the same gold that they did not give for the Egel is what they gave for the Mishkan, which shows that the fact they didn't give it their jewelry for the Egel was not because they held it precious and dear and didn't want to give it away. They were happily ready to give it away by the time when it came to donating to the Mishkan, but they refused to participate in this egel. And this is explained in the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer explains that Aaron used specifically the wording he used to tell the people to bring their gold and silver was specifically take the jewelry of your wives and your children, because he was sure that the woman wouldn't give it, and this would help delay and possibly prevent the egel from happening. And so we see that Aaron knew that the woman would be strong in their faith and not give in to this idea of creating a golden calf, an idol. And this is the merit of the women by Matan Torah, that they really absorbed the message of Matan Torah and serving Hashem and did not fall afterwards. And then by the contribution from the Mishkan, the woman used a special and unique talent to contribute. It says in there in Parshas Vayakol, where it discusses the donations, that the woman spun the wool while it was on the goats, which was a unique talent and craft that they had to be able to do this. Now Rashi explains what's so special about this, besides for it being a unique talent, is that the quality of the wool was better while it was still on the goat, and by spinning the wool on the goat itself before it was shaved off, was keeping a unique quality within their contribution. There's also the additional advantage of the tahara, because we know when an animal dies, there's a certain aspect of tumah involved, and I guess the cutting of the wool off of the sheep also gives it an opportunity to connect with tumah, while it's still on the body of the animal. It can't become tummy, and it's uniquely has a unique tahara that otherwise would not be present were the wool to be sheared and then spun. That's what the Maharsha adds. And in addition, in Chassidus explains the idea that the donation they were giving was actually from the aspect of life. From the within the world, there's four levels of objects. There's the inanimate object, the living plants, there's the animal life, and the human being. And this is a certain hierarchy in their spiritual levels. And so usually a carbon is given. We have carbonis from animals, and we have carbonis from flour and from produce. And we also have salt on the Mizbeach, which kind of gives all levels within our carbonis. However, obviously the carbon from the animal kingdom is the much higher spiritual level. So the fact that they were not just giving a cloth or a material that was an inanimate object, but they're actually bringing the sheep themselves or the goats themselves to as their donation, with the wool spun already on their back, is giving something of a higher spiritual quality within their donation. So here we see the unique quality that the woman contributed, both by the time of the giving of the Torah, and also by their donations for the Mishkan. But all this was relevant in all times and in our past history. But more and mainly now, there's a unique and special connection of women to the Geulah, which is to coming of Mashiach, which is really most relevant as we are getting closer and closer to the time of Mashiach. And so that's something that we want to focus on now. So Chazal say, the Gemara in Sicha says, "B'schar nashim tzedkani shahiu ba'isa hadar negalu Yisrael mitzrayim." That it's in the merit of the righteous women that were in that generation that the Jewish people were redeemed from Mitzrayim. Similarly, in the Navi Micha says, "Ki me'seis chameretz Mitzrayim erenu neflais." Just as in the times of Mitzrayim, we will see wonders. In other words, in the future redemption will be similar to the redemption from Mitzrayim. And the Yalkut Shemaini adds that the Ein Hadaris Negalin Ela B'schar Nashim Tzidkani Yesh Badar, that in each generation, all these generations that had their own Geulah, their own redemption, was only in the schus of the Nashim Tzidkaniyes, the righteous women in their generation. So just like it was in the time of Mitzrayim, that it was in the merit of the righteous woman that the whole Jewish people was redeemed and came out with a unique and special Geulah, so too in the final Geulah, it's the Jewish woman whose merit will bring that redemption for the entire Jewish people and for the whole world. And it's even more strongly emphasized, according to what's explained in the Arizal, that the generation of the people who will have this Geulah of Mashiach are a Gilgal, a reincarnation of the generation that left Mitzrayim. So according to this, we can understand that the Jewish woman who left Mitzrayim, in whose merit the entire Geulas Mitzrayim happened, are reincarnated, and their neshamas are within the Jewish women of this generation that's going to be leaving Galus now. And that is a unique power that the Jewish women have, that we have, that we're not just new people, but we have the power and the neshamas and the kayach of the women who've done this already before in the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now, why is this so relevant? The previous Rabbi Rayat exclaimed many times that that we are getting closer and closer to the time of Mashiach. The Geulah is almost here. And the Rebbe continued throughout the years of his leadership, explaining how now is coming to the time of the redemption. The time of Mashiach is coming. And we're standing already at the threshold. These Jewish leaders had a unique foresight, as if they can see the Geulah on the horizon. The Rabbeim already has the previous Rebbe said we've already finished everything that we need to do to bring the Geulah. All of the work of Galus is complete, and we're standing ready to greet Mashiach. And so this is why the previous Rebbe made such an effort in connecting with the Jewish women and strengthening them and empowering them, because they're the ones in whose merit Mashiach is going to come. And so we really need to be strengthened and ready with all the tools and inspiration that it's going to take to bring Mashiach. Now, in addition to the advantage of the woman in bringing the Mashiach, the women also have a special, unique position at the time of Mashiach itself. By the time of the Geulah itself, the dynamic of the spiritual world and therefore of the physical world is going to change. Until now, in the time of Galus, the spiritual in the Navi Yirmiyahu, it says Nekeva Tesayv Gever, that at the time of Mashiach, the woman will surround the man. And in Mishlei, it says Ishes Chayil Taras Baila, at the time of Mashiach, the woman will be the crown of her husband. Now, what does this mean? So there's the 10 spheres, of which Malchus is the lowest. Malchus is representative of the feminine aspect. The other 9 spheres, or I should say the 7 emotional spheres, represent the masculine, and they give to Malchus, which is the Makabel. So we have the concept of Mashpia and Makabel, Za, which is the 7 emotional attributes, and Malchus. So during the time of Galus, Za is Mashpia and Malchus is the Makabel, which is representative of the idea of the man, masculine, being dominant and the woman being the receiver and the nurturer and developer of that which the Mashpia gives. However, at the time of Mashiach, it will be revealed that essentially in her source, Malchus is really higher than Za, that the feminine aspect is really much higher than the masculine aspect. And this is true in its source as it is now. However, it's not revealed that way because now we don't see Malchus in her source. So at the time of Mashiach, Malchus will be revealed in her source, where Malchus and Mashpia, Malchus and Za will be equal, at least, if not Malchus being higher. So this represents the idea that at the moment the masculine is the mashpia and the feminine is the makabel. However, at the time of Mashiach, the feminine will no longer be receiving from the man, rather she will be dominating and surrounding, just like the terms that the Navi and the Mishle use, Nikiva to Saiviv Gever, that the woman surrounds the man, and that Eishes Chayil Ataras Baila, the woman is a crown of her husband. In other words, a crown, something that is above the head. And this idea is also expressed in representative of the dynamic between the sun and the moon. Like we know in the beginning of creation, the sun and the moon were equal. And then they had a little bit of an argument, and this moon was diminished. Now the sun is the mashpia and the moon is makabel. And the moon now is smaller and she receives all her light from the sun. However, at the time of Mashiach, the sun and the moon will go back to their original sizes and they will both be equal. However, it will be in a much greater way than it was at the time of creation. And essentially the whole idea of Geulah is the world being perfected similar to the way it was before Chet Hadas in the time of Gan Eden, however, in a much greater way, since it's already gone through such a rigorous process of refinement throughout history. And so this expresses to us the unique aspect of the feminine and the woman at the time of Mashiach, and why it's so valuable and important for the women now to prepare themselves for that time and to strengthen themselves to be the merit which will bring us to that point. So that's the conclusion of the first ice of this Sicha, the first section of this Sicha, which is of 8 sections. And what's so amazing to me about it is that it's so rich and so detailed already, and this is only the foundation and setting the stage for what the Rebbe is going to teach us in the coming sections of the Sicha. So this is really just laying the foundations and the backdrop and giving us an idea of where we're going with this, and it's already empowering me and giving me this feeling of strength and excitement to be the ones to bring the Mashiach. And what I love about this also is that right now the Rebbe didn't really say anything new. He's only bringing up sources from the Torah, from the Gemara, from the Nevi'im and Kesuvim, and showing us where we find in Torah these discussions of the importance of the Jewish woman and the power of the Jewish woman and our role and merit in bringing the Geulah, which is essentially the entire purpose of our world. So now I'm going to just go. Actually, there's one more thing I wanted to add in connection to this idea of the woman being superior by the time of Mashiach, which is expressed in the last 2 brachas of the 7 brachas that are said by the Jewish wedding, by Chuppah and the Sheva brachas. So if we take a look at those 2 brachas, we see there's a phrase that's used similarly in each, but slightly different. We'll see in the last bracha, it says, Samach to Samach, Re'em ha'ahuvim kasamecha yitzircha b'ganeda mikedem, Baruch atah Hashem esameich chasam v'kala. Grant abundant joy to those loving friends as you bestow gladness upon your created beings in the Garden of Eden of old. Blessed are you, Hashem, who gladdens the groom and the bride. And here we see the chassan is mentioned before the kala, because in a time of galus and now, the chassan is the man, is the mashpia on the kala, and so he comes first. However, in the next bracha, we're already talking about the time of Mashiach, and there the wording is slightly different. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher bara sasan v'simcha chasan v'chala Geulah rina ditza v'chadva ava v'achla shalom v'reyos mehira Hashem Elokeinu yishama ba'ara Yehuda v'chutzes Yerushalayim kol sasan v'kol simcha kol chasan v'kol kala kol mesalis chasanim mechupasam v'na'arim mimishtanim ginasam Baruch atah Hashem mesameach chasan im hakala. So here we see the words chasan im hakala, that the chasan is with the kala equally. It's not one before the other. And this is coming after the whole discussion in this bracha about the time of Mashiach. Mehira Hashem Elokeinu Yishama Ba'ar Yehuda V'chutis Yerushalayim is a time, it's talking about the time of Mashiach. And there also, it says Kol Sasan V'Kol Simcha, Kol Chasan V'Kol Kala. And it mentions the voice of the Kala. Right now, when by Jewish wedding, the chuppah, the Chasan says, Harei at mekudeshes li, and the Kala gives her silent consent. She doesn't say a word. Because at the time, now, the chassan is mashpia, the woman is makabel, and makabel is that which is just accepting of whatever the chassan gives her. She doesn't really have that voice to express in this regard. However, at the time of Mashiach, we hear the kol kala as well. The voice of the kala is heard, and that's an idea that's expressing the spiritual dynamic of Mashpia Makabel in the time of Galus and Geulah, the idea, the spiritual dynamic of the spheres of Zah and Malchus, which plays out eventually as it evolves in the physical world. But as we are now getting closer and closer to time of Mashiach, we can see in the world already a huge change in that dynamic, which is in itself quite unique. Now, I'm just going to go back to that Sicha Hayadua that I mentioned, the talk of the previous Rebbe to the woman in Riga, just so that we can have a look at what the previous Rebbe had said to them and what lessons we can learn about that for ourselves. And then in the next shir, we're going to be going on to the next section, number 2 out of 8, where the Rebbe expresses the unique connection between a number of Jewish women whose yard site is in the time of this month of Shvat, when the Rebbe is speaking, which is connected to the yard site of the previous Rebbe on the 10th of Shvat, whose whole mission was to bring the Geulah and to prepare the world for Mashiach. So we see a very unique connection between these Jewish women and their passing and the passing of the leader of the generation, the previous Rebbe, whose whole effort was to prepare the world for Mashiach. And that will be in the next section. So going back to this talk of the previous Rebbe to the woman in Riga, the previous Rebbe mentions there this idea that we've already discussed of the 2 times when the woman came first, by the giving of the Torah and by the donations from the Mishkan. And the Rebbe says we say the bracha asher the bracha on the Torah asher nasan lanu Torahs emes v'chai olam nata b'sochenu, that Hashem gives us an everlasting Torah which is there as a lesson for us in our life. And we say the bracha asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'nasan lanu es Torah, so baruch atah Hashem nosein ha'Torah, that Hashem is the nosein ha'Torah in present tense, that Hashem is always giving us the Torah. So this idea that Torah, the giving of the ideas within Torah and the way the Torah is written is something that's relevant to and a lesson to our daily life. And there's also this idea of the constant giving of the Torah. And within our homes, within our families, that constant giving of the Torah is the idea of Jewish education, which is something that we have to give every generation anew to our children, the Jewish education and the education of Torah. So when it comes to Matan Torah, we see the idea of Kos Tomar Lebeis Yaakov V'Sagil B'nei Yisrael before the giving of the Torah, and after the giving of the Torah, Hashem also says to Tagid the B'nei Yisrael, to tell the B'nei Yisrael how. So we see a difference though. In the beginning, Before Matan Torah, Hashem said to speak to the women and to the men. After the giving of the Torah, Hashem says to speak to the men. So what does this represent? What does this signify? What can we learn from this? So when it comes to our own homes and to educating our children, there is two aspects. There's the aspect of the before Matan Torah and afterwards. The idea of before Matan Torah is the initiation of bringing our children to a Jewish school, bringing our children to Jewish education. And there it's the woman's job to take responsibility to choose a proper Jewish school with leaders and teachers, educators who have Yiras Shamayim, who are God-fearing, and who will be dedicated to imbuing their children and the students with proper Jewish education with Yiras Shamayim. And just as a parenthetical note, it's important to recognize that nowadays, just because a school has the name Jewish and because it serves kosher food, does not mean it is a institution of Yiras Shamayim and has God-fearing teachers. And it's important that we investigate and look into the education that's being given before we choose a school for our children. We really need to think about who is going to be teaching them, who is influencing them. Are these people who really care about the Torah, who really care about the Jewish future, and imbuing our children with a proper Yiras Shamayim? And this is the responsibility of the Jewish women, just as the women were involved were told before Matan Torah that to be spoken to. So it is the women who have this responsibility to take in the education, the giving of the Torah for their children that is a foundation for their life, and it's the foundation for what they will become. And so Jewish women need to take that responsibility and recognize that the future is in their hands, and educating their children, whether it's through sending them to school, or for some people it means homeschooling, or for some people it means at home giving them education in addition to what they're getting in school. This is the foundation of their life, and this is what is going to determine how are they going to turn out. What level of Yiras Shamayim will they have is really dependent on the education that they get in the schools they go to. And this is something that's really the responsibility in the hands of their mother, the Jewish woman. And then afterwards, after they come home from school and they've had their Jewish education and they've learned something, it's the father's responsibility to follow up on it, to speak to them about, what did you learn in school? Tell me what you've learned, and to ask them the parsha questions and to test them and see what their progress is. This is and to speak with them in Torah learning. That's the job of the father when they come home from school, as it's representative of the idea of Hashem saying to speak to the men after the giving of the Torah. So this is a unique lesson that the previous Rebbe was giving to the Jewish women in Riga. And really at that time, it was difficult to find Jewish education, and it was quite a dedication to have to send the children to Jewish schools. And this is, however, the future is dependent on it. And so the Rebbe was really empowering the Jewish women then, as the mothers, to make that choice to send their children to Jewish institutions with God-fearing teachers. The next lesson that the previous Rebbe goes into is the idea of the lesson that we learned from the donations of the Mishkan. And there it discusses 4 types of jewelry that the woman gave. There were earrings, nose rings, finger rings, and according to Ibn Ezra, the bracelets, and according to Rashi, a different type of jewelry. And these types of jewelry also give us a certain insight into what our education for our children should look like. Firstly, the earrings. Earrings represents the idea of listening to the lessons of the Torah, listening to the guidance of the Torah in how to educate our children, listening to the leaders of and educators who follow in the guidance of the Torah to understand what the proper approach is. There are so many different parenting approaches, so many different education approaches out there in the world today, and it's important that our first step should be to look at, what does Torah say? What do our leaders today say? What is the proper way to raise our children? What's the proper way to educate? What methods should we use? And it's important to find leaders and educators who are well aware of the unique dynamic of our generation in order to really get a proper guidance in the Hiras of Torah as to how we'll go about teaching our children. And secondly, also to listen to our children, listen to the way they're speaking among themselves, and see what is it that they are learning from us. What is it that they are gaining from us? Because children really learn from example. They see the way we speak among ourselves, they see the way we speak to each other and to them, and they will follow and do the same. So are we listen out to our children and say, are we really giving them the proper words that we want them to use, the proper tone of voice? Are we giving them are they learning from us in a proper way to speak among themselves? It's interesting whenever I hear my children using a certain type of phrase or tone of voice that I am not approving of or surprised by. I always think about like, have they been hearing that from me? Have I been speaking in that way? Is that why they're talking like this? And so listen out and hear what are our children saying. So that's the earrings. The next is the nose rings. The nose rings represents that sense of smell. It's a certain sense. It's quite a finer sense to kind of sense what sort of influences are our children being influenced by? Who are their friends? Who are they hanging out with? What other media are they being influenced by? And understand and recognize if they are in the proper influence or if something needs to change. Take note of who our children are hanging out with, who are their friends, are they good influence, and if that's something suitable for them. The next jewelry was the finger rings. It's not enough just to take lessons of how to educate. It's not just enough to sense and make sure our children are with proper influences and good friends, but we really need to set an example and to actually explicitly tell them what we expect of them, what the Torah expects of them, what is the proper way to act. We can't expect them to know it themselves. We need to point it out, just like a finger, pointing, explaining, showing, to tell them what is the proper way. Don't just assume they're going to pick it up. We need to really explain it to them. It's interesting. A friend recently told me a story of what happened in her home when she saw her daughter drawing very hard with a marker on the paper, and it was going to make a hole in the paper, which would then the ink would run through onto the tablecloth. And she instinctively, shouted, "No, don't do that! Look at what you're doing! You're making the mark on the tablecloth." And her daughter was slightly shocked and started to cry. She was very sad because she didn't think she was doing anything wrong. She was never told, don't draw hard or don't draw on this tablecloth. She wasn't, told that this is something wrong. And when her mother instinctively reacted in such a way, she was quite shocked and upset and hurt because, and this could have been avoided had her mother perhaps told her beforehand, when we color, make sure to do it softly, or we don't want to get any marks on the tablecloth, so let's put something underneath your paper just in case. And this little foresight and step ahead of telling them what to do in advance before it's already becomes an issue will save so much pain and heartache. So don't assume our children know. Tell them clearly before it happens so we don't have to then make an issue of it, and we don't have to be upset about it, and it doesn't have to cause any pain or guilt that they've done something wrong when they didn't realize that this was an issue to begin with. So really it's not enough just to be an example, but also to really tell our children and explain to them what is the proper way. And then we come to the fourth piece of jewelry, which according to Ben Ezra was a bracelet, which is a bit of the idea of an arm, a strong arm. We do need a bit of discipline. And like I said, I think this idea of discipline and setting boundaries and showing them, what is important, and saying, yes, now is the time for learning. We can't always play. Now when we're sitting in class, we need to focus. We can't just let everything be hefker and fun and well, fun, yes, but not everything can be hefker and without boundaries and without discipline. There needs to be a certain set of structure and recognize the focus and value of Torah learning and of mitzvahs and what we're doing to really set boundaries and priorities. And like I said, I think when this comes with a foresight and a preference to the situation, the discipline is much more of a pleasant discipline. So we're putting up the boundaries and the fences where they need to be before they're crossed, as opposed to backtracking and saying, no, you shouldn't be doing that after it's already been done. And I think that's a really important aspect of discipline that we often forget. Sometimes we think that discipline means to reprimand someone for doing something wrong. But I think perhaps discipline can also mean showing them where the line is before they get there, so they don't have to even cross that line. Putting up lines, putting up boundaries is part of discipline, and showing our children what is important, what is valued, and where we need to put our energy. Now, according to Rashi, this fourth piece of jewelry wasn't an armband, but it was a different type of jewelry, which represents the idea of Taharas HaMishpacha. Now, we know that the value and importance of Taharas HaMishpacha in our family life and the impact and influence it has on the spirituality of our children. And the importance of this mitzvah is something that we also need to share with others. It's even when we ourselves are, keeping the mitzvah properly and it's having a proper influence on our home as it should be, we can then take it a step further and share it with other people who may not yet be keeping the mitzvah of Taharas HaMishpacha, and influence our friends in a nice way, sharing with them the value and the importance that it has, because it really has a huge impact on the home and on the children and their spiritual levels, which and also physically as well. So that's the lesson that the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe told over to the women in Riga in 1934, and it's a lesson that we can all take for ourselves as well. And may this grant us and our husbands and our families happiness, health, and prosperity. And we should bring our children up in the way of Torah mitzvahs with Avos Hashem and Yiras Hashem, to Torah, Chuppah, and Ma'asim Tovim, and we all have much nachas from our children. And for those who are not yet blessed with children, may God bless them. They should also have children and happiness in their homes and in the way of Torah mitzvahs. So that is the conclusion of the